Um, As you can see from the contents that we've laid out here, we got a lot of ground to cover. I'm aiming for about 25 minutes of presentation and then time for 5 or 10 minutes of discussion at the end. So let's jump right in and see where this next 20 minutes or so takes us. Our focus today is primarily going to be on the methodology behind this analysis, but because it's in multiple sclerosis and a lot of that methodology touches on specific elements of multiple sclerosis, I think we want to lay out just a little bit of background on the disease for everyone. If you're not familiar with MS, it's a chronic progressive neurological disease. It has a really heterogeneous course that affects patients over their entire lifetimes. Some of the hallmarks of that course are these intermittent inflammatory relapses, and that's also comes along with just an increasing disability over time. So there are lots of studies out there that show that the burden of the disease, whether you're talking about the cost burden or the quality of life burden, is really driven by this disability status, which just sort of marches on and gets progressively worse as patients move through the disease. It has been a really fruitful area for drug development. If we look over the last 3 decades or so, there have been about 20 disease-modifying therapies that have come to market. These therapies have been shown to reduce the frequency of relapses. They delay the worsening of this disability progression that I mentioned, and they also can, some of the more recent ones, promote some disability improvement, which is a real benefit to patients. However, that sheer number of those therapies that have come to market has led to some really complex treatment pathway decisions. So if you follow MS, you'll know that the treatment sequencing is a real area of uncertainty, can be. So our goal here was to really try to get at how we can use real world data, right? We have 20 DMTs that are out there. They've been out there, some of them for almost 3 decades. So there's a lot of real world data on their use. How can we use that real world data to conduct both clinical and economic evaluations of these disease-modifying therapy options in MS? That's really was our question going in here. If we look, I mean, there are a number of multiple sclerosis registries out there that have this real-world data. The analyses of these, there are a lot of comparative treatment effectiveness analyses that you can go to the literature and find, but these analyses are typically not done with the needs of economic evaluations, modelers like me, payers, HTA agencies, whoever the economic audience would be. They were not done with their needs in mind. So our objective was really from the beginning to design and conduct a comparative effectiveness analysis of treatment alternatives in multiple sclerosis that explicitly accounted from the beginning for the eventual requirements of MS cost effectiveness modeling. So that's as an objective statement what we were out to accomplish. And the goal here today is really to share with you the design and conduct part of that. Won't really get into the results of the analysis. That's a discussion for another day. So we have these 2 broad buckets of different types of analyses and ways to evaluate treatments. There's a really rich literature out there in both of these areas. There's a lot of literature on real-world comparative effectiveness in MS. There are also a couple decades worth of cost-effectiveness models in the literature for MS. And there's some specific differences here that we have to bridge if we're going to succeed in our objective. So if we look at populations, real-world comparative effectiveness analyses in MS are dealing with heterogeneous data, often coming from multinational data sources. The treatment choices reflect real-world treatment patterns with different treatments coming to market in different countries at different times over the courses of a decade or 2. Can be really messy. On the other hand, when we do a cost-effectiveness model, we tend to have a hypothetical cohort looking at a very specific indication in a very specific country that we can evaluate sort of 2 treatments head-to-head. So some differences in population there. There are differences in approach. Comparative effectiveness analyses tend to use some statistical regression modeling to compare 2 treatments, whereas the cost-effectiveness models have a really established Markov-based modeling approach that exists in MS. So how do we bridge that gap? There are differences in outcomes. The comparative effectiveness analyses tend to estimate things like risk ratios and hazard ratios for key outcomes of interest in MS, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Models don't typically use those, cost effectiveness models don't typically use those outcomes directly. They need transition matrices and relapse rates by disability score in a way that can be connected to costs and quality of life. So again, we're starting to see that there's some differences between the methodologies on these two types of analyses that we're going to need to be able to bridge if we're going to be successful in reaching our objective. Another key thing to be aware of, and this actually becomes central to some of the benefits of our approach, is that when we do a comparative effectiveness analysis, really we only follow patients for as long as they're on a particular treatment or until they're lost to follow-up in the data source. Maybe discontinuation is considered as an outcome if you're analyzing treatment persistence, but generally these analyses don't worry about what happens after the treatment of interest is discontinued, and they don't really have to worry about how to extrapolate any observed effectiveness over longer time horizons. It's really confined to the observed data in the data source. On the other hand, the cost effectiveness models tend to have a lifetime horizon. So as a necessity, we have to look at things like treatment discontinuation, what happens after discontinuation. We have to be able to extrapolate observed treatment effect over long-term horizons in order to get really an estimate of long-term clinical and economic value. And there's a lot of results out there that show that long-term clinical and economic value in MS really does depend on how these extrapolation and post-discontinuation pieces play out. So there's a lot here that we have to overcome if we're going to successfully design a comparative effectiveness analysis and make it suitable for a cost effectiveness model in MS. Okay, so at a really high level, what we did up front is we identified some of these key areas with population methodology and our sort of the analytical approach and the key outcomes, and we tailored specific elements of that to what we knew the cost effectiveness model was eventually going to need. So in particular, in terms of defining the population, there are two key things to point out. We used a propensity score matching algorithm to make sure that we had well-matched treatment groups in our analysis. That's perhaps not so uncommon in the comparative effectiveness analysis research or in the literature, but it's particularly important for the cost effectiveness model. And another thing we did was we included a common reference treatment group, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So suppose we wanted to evaluate or compare a treatment A versus treatment B for multiple sclerosis. Traditionally, you could just estimate, a risk ratio or a hazard ratio and say, is treatment A better than treatment B on such and such an outcome? That really can be quite limiting in a cost effectiveness model, where what you really need is a sort of a common comparator. So similar to the way that you might see a placebo group or a standard of care group in a meta-analysis of clinical trial data, we wanted to have a common reference treatment group in our analysis so that we had maybe treatment A and treatment B both versus a common reference group. That common reference group opens up a whole host of possibilities about extrapolation and long-term assumptions that are going to be important for scenario analyses in the cost effectiveness model. So that was a really important part of our approach from the beginning. Another key thing here, and this has to do more with the propensity score matching, is that we were able to use the propensity score approach to match on things like country and index year in the data source. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specific data source we used in a second. But we were able to match on country and index year, which helped smooth out some of the messy differences in real-world treatment patterns that you would expect to see if you looked inside of a registry. So analytically, what we did is we then compared our treatments of interest, which really was two treatments, it doesn't really matter which ones they are, treatment A and treatment B. We compared them versus this common reference group in a way that unlocked a lot of long-term post-discontinuation and extrapolation scenarios. And as we looked at this, there were two key ways that we could analyze the data that we found, labeled here as option 1 and option 2. The first option tries to use the data directly. So we can get in and analyze for the treatments that we're interested in. We can analyze treatment-specific relapse rates. We can analyze treatment-specific and estimate treatment-specific transition probability matrices between different disability scores. So you'll see EDSS here, which is a common measure used to estimate disability in MS. So we can get in and analyze the data and get treatment-specific relapse rates and transition probability matrices. And that's really the most direct use of the data, and that works with the model, but it can be a little bit limited. So we identified this second option where we used traditional comparative effectiveness outcomes like risk ratios and hazard ratios. We took those for the treatments that we were interested in relative to this common reference group that I mentioned. And we used those to derive the treatment-specific relapse rates and matrices that we needed in the model in a way that was more flexible for extrapolation. And it's really this second option that I think it was a little bit different and opens up some new things that maybe wouldn't have been possible before. So those are two sort of key approaches, and I realize I'm staying at a high level with them. If folks are interested in more, then hearing a little bit more, we can come back to the difference between those two options when we get to the when we have some time for discussion at the end. Okay, so we've laid out at a real high level the objective, the sort of the key elements of our approach that we needed to tailor in order to make our comparative effectiveness analysis work for a cost effectiveness model. I want to talk for a moment about the data source that we use to then conduct these analyses. So we worked with some partners at MS-BASE. MS-BASE is a multinational longitudinal data set that has tens of thousands of patient records for patients with MS. It does data come from over 40 countries. The first patients were enrolled back in 2003, so there's quite a bit of longitudinal data on some patients. And data are collected at least annually for a number of variables that are directly relevant to what a MS cost effectiveness model might need. So in addition to having baseline demographic data like sex and age, it collects the disability measures that are needed. It also collects the frequency of relapses, and it also collects, importantly, the specific treatments that patients start and when they stop them. So there's a lot of data in this database that is fit for purpose for cost effectiveness modeling, as long as we can set up our analyses in a way that unlocks that potential. So we were really pleased to get to work with this particular registry because of the richness of the data that they had available and how we could make it fit for the model, for the cost effectiveness model. So, so far, and I'm keeping an eye on my watch here, we've got about 5 minutes or so till we'll get to questions. So hopefully you guys are starting to get those queued up. But so far, we've really focused more on the key concepts and sort of the high level parts of our approach. It wouldn't be a proper methodology talk if we didn't stop and dig into some of the technical details here, if this is of interest to you all out there. Some of this is very specific to MS, so I won't get into all of the weeds of implementation criteria and the data source and all of these things, but I want to point out a few things. So the decision problem that we were looking at in our cost effectiveness model was whether it was to evaluate two different treatment escalation options for a very specific subset of patients with MS. So these are patients with what's known as relapsing remitting MS, which is the most common form of MS. These patients have already been treated with a first-line disease-modifying therapy, but they're not adequately responding to that. So there's inadequate response to a first-line disease-modifying therapy, and we wanted to evaluate whether it was better to switch to treatment A or to treatment B. So our two primary comparators were treatment A and treatment B. The common reference group that we defined in our model was sort of switching to another first-line therapy. So instead of escalating to treatment A or treatment B, patients also could switch to another first-line therapy. There's a big bucket of first-line therapies out there for MS, so that was our common reference group. There are some criteria you can see here. We laid out, which patients and how we found them in the database. In addition to switching between the treatments in question, how do we define this inadequate response piece? There's some guidance out there, regulatory guidance, et cetera, on what inadequate response means. So we were able to implement that in the database using some of the very specific criteria that you see here. And once we had that population defined, we then were able to conduct this three-way propensity score matching algorithm using fairly traditional propensity score approaches. I think what is unique here is that we were doing it across 3 cohorts simultaneously. So treatment A, treatment B, and then this common reference group. In addition to matching on key patient characteristics, we were able to match on key things, key elements of disease and treatment history. So how long they'd had MS, how many prior relapses they'd had, and things like that. So with these 2 pieces, we were able to identify the patients we wanted in the database, and we were able to appropriately match them in a way that we had, adjusted for the differences in patients between the 3 treatment cohorts. So we had, from this, we were able to then get 3 well-matched treatment groups. Once we had our matched treatment groups, we needed to go into the database and define the outcomes in question that we were looking at. So the top panel here shows a couple sort of what are, I would say, are more traditional comparative effectiveness outcomes. We can look at annualized relapse rates, which is how many relapse rates per year would patients experience. We can also look at time to first relapse. So that's a common outcome, how long until a patient has their first relapse. And then there are also these 2 outcomes on time to 6-month confirmed disability worsening and time to 6-month confirmed disability improvement. So how long until a patient experiences either a worsening or an improvement of their disability? How long from when they switch treatments until they experience one of these changes? There are a couple points here where we really needed to look to the literature and to regulatory guidance to help define these outcomes. Defining a relapse comes with lots of criteria. Some of the clinical criteria are here. We didn't have to worry about that too much because the clinicians participating in the database would just report whether a patient had a relapse, but this is the criteria for a relapse that exist in the data that we were using. The question of confirming changes in disability is one that we sort of inherit from the regulatory world, that confirmation of changes in disability is often required for disability endpoints in clinical trials. So it's become important that we implement that in comparative effectiveness analyses also. But we did set it up with some scenarios in our whether we wanted to require 6-month confirmation or 3-month confirmation of these changes in order to qualify as an improvement or a worsening event. So we have those sort of traditional outcomes. And then we needed a very specific, different kind of outcome in order to estimate a transition probability matrix for the patients that we were identifying in the 3 different treatment groups. So what we needed there was to look longitudinally at each patient that we had and identify year-long intervals. So over for a given patient, we might have a year-long interval where we knew what the EDSS or the disability score was at both the beginning and the end of that year. And then we would allow, if a patient was followed for 5 years, they might contribute 5 different intervals to our analysis, right? 5 different year-long intervals where we knew what the disability was at the beginning and the end. And what that did is it allows us to just see how patients are moving from between EDSS scores over the course of a year. So that's an outcome that you would not find if you looked at published comparative effectiveness analyses in MS, but that it becomes very important for fitting this data into a model, a cost effectiveness model. Okay, so we have our populations, or they're well matched. We have defined the outcomes that we need, and then we were able to jump in and do some of the statistical analyses that we needed. I've laid out the statistical methods here. We used Poisson regression modeling for relapse rates. We used Kaplan-Meier approaches with marginal Cox regressions for all the time to first event outcomes that we had. And then the third bucket of analyses we needed to conduct were to use these year-long EDSS intervals, which I mentioned, and use those to construct matrices that would tell us in any given year what's the probability that a patient would move from one EDSS score to another. So if what's the probability of moving from EDSS 4 to EDSS 6, for example. EDSS is a measure that ranges from 0 to 10. So we were able to do these analyses. The results of the comparative effectiveness analysis were then, by design, fit for purpose for cost effectiveness modeling. So we were able to take those from the comparative effectiveness analysis output and put it into and develop a separate cost effectiveness model. I'm not talking more about the cost effectiveness model itself today, but I will just say sort of the end of this is that we had really an integrated real-world clinical and economic evaluation of different MS treatment alternatives. And the cost-effectiveness model that we ultimately built had a wide range of scenario analysis capabilities and lots of structural flexibility that then could be used to meet global HTA standards. So we were able to use it for HTA submissions and discussions across lots of different countries on account of the work that went into the design of the analysis. Our work was associated with all the limitations you would normally expect for comparative effectiveness analyses. I've listed a couple of them here. I will say that a lot of the typical limitations of cost effectiveness analyses we were able to overcome, and they were mitigated by the design that went into the comparative effectiveness analysis we were using. So the result here really, we hope, serves as a model for what we would think of as real-world cost effectiveness analyses. So real-world effectiveness data going into a cost effectiveness model that can conduct real-world economic evaluations. And in the end, we were, I think, successful in this, and hopefully that serves as a model for other folks that would be interested in doing the same thing. So here are some references that we used, and I mentioned that this publication will be out hopefully soon. So if you're interested in more, you can follow up there.